Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reweaving Ourselves, Contemporary Ecology through the Ideas of Juan Downey, a conference divided in 4 weekly sessions that we have organized in order to continue exploring contemporary ecological discussion, in this case, through the historical perspective offered by the work of the Chilean artist Juan Downey. I am Inés Katzenstein, Director of the Cisneros Institute and Curator of Latin American Art at MoMA. I'm very excited to launch this, our second conference, organized as part of a 3-year research initiative on the connections between art and the environment in contemporary Latin America, which will culminate with the publication of a bilingual anthology. Our idea with the conference that starts today is to consider the pioneering work of Juan Downey as a way to shed light on some of the key developments that have been taking place in Latin American culture over the last decades. Downey's visionary understanding of the intertwinements between architecture, politics, technology, and indigenous worlds opens extremely rich possibilities to think comparatively about our present. Juan Downey is represented in MoMA collection with 15 works and is an artist central to many of the curatorial discussions taking place at the moment at the museum. But his work will not be strictly, this conference, will not be strictly about Downey, but about the ecological present of Latin America, featuring distinguished group of artists and contemporary thinkers, brought together by the lens that Downey's work provides. In order to engage in this exercise, we have invited one of the most distinguished experts on the work of Downey, Julieta González, as guest curator of the conference. Julieta has written several essays on the Chilean artist. She organized 2 exhibitions, Juan Downey, the Invisible Architect at the Bronx Museum in 2011, and Juan Downey, A Communications Utopia at the Museo Tamayo in 2013. And just last year, she co-edited the most complete monograph on his work. In addition to her focus projects on Downey, Julieta has worked as curator at Tate Modern, Museo Tamayo, Bronx Museum, and MASPI, among other institutions. I'm very grateful to Julieta, who has structured a program that in its first session today will present Downey's art and ideas, and in subsequent sessions will keep his work in mind while simultaneously diverging from it in order to explore new paths and realities in ecological thinking. Today's introductory session, then, is dedicated to discussing the main ideas and works in which Downey anticipated our present. To do this, Julieta will be in conversation with Javier Rivero Ramos, her co-editor of the Juan Downey monograph I referred minutes ago. Javier is also a PhD candidate at the Department of Art and Archaeology of Princeton University. And in addition to his work on Downey, hi Javier, recently he edited the first monograph devoted to the great Rafael Montañez Ortiz, published by the Museo del Barrio this year. On behalf of the museum, I want to thank Julieta for her work in organizing this conference, and to Javier for sharing his profound knowledge of Downey with us today. Before starting the session, I would also like to thank Patty Cisneros, who I am sure has joined us today, for having imagined this research institute and for her continuous hard work and generosity towards Latin American art in MoMA. Hi, Julieta. And behind the scenes of all this online conference, there's always a team working. I'm very grateful to Maria del Carmen Carrion and to Madeline Turner of the Cisneros Institute for their amazing work organizing this event, as well as to the MoMA AV team for helping us broadcasting it. At the end of the conversation, the participant will take questions from the audience. So during the event, you might submit your questions to all panelists and participants via the chat function, which is on the right-hand side at the bottom of your screen. Our speakers will do their best to respond as many questions as possible. For those who prefer to follow the dialogue with subtitles, we have a closed captioning service, so please click on the CC feature, which is at the bottom of your screen, in order to connect with it. I would also like to let you know that this session will be posted on our website with Spanish subtitles after December. So without further ado, I thank you for joining us today, and I turn over to Julieta. Thank you.
Hello, Ines and everyone at MoMA and seeing this conference today. Thank you all for being here today in this first session of the conference, which is devoted to dissecting some aspects of Juan Downey's work as an introduction to the rest of the sessions. An important question that this conference would like to address is the following. Who was Juan Downey and why is he relevant today in terms of ecological thinking in Latin America? Juan Downey was born in Santiago de Chile in 1940 and died in New York City in 1993. He was originally an architect by training, but as an artist, he worked at the intersection of architecture, technology, anthropology, culture, and the environment, to name just a few fields that he addressed in his work. Downey's pioneering work and writings can be considered as acutely prescient of the discussions taking place today on ecology, post-development, and anthropology, especially in the global South and of course in Latin America. And they operate in the context of this conference as a matrix for the production of ideas and discussions around these subjects. This conference is thus aligned with Downey's conception of ecology from different perspectives. The perspective of cybernetics, that of anthropology, and of the ways in which his work and thought pose challenges to the ontoepistemic formations of capitalist modernity. In the past decade or so, the intersecting concerns that guided Juan Downey's work in the 70s have gained renewed currency amongst Latin American artists and thinkers, many of whom have sought to form alliances with and give visibility to indigenous communities and activist groups working in these directions. However, the current situation brings new challenges. On the one hand, the impending global ecological crisis that Downey and his contemporaries foresaw in the 1960s and 70s has significantly aggravated. On the other hand, the neural network of communications that he imagined, while it's a reality today that shapes our world in manifold ways, it has not been instrumental in the struggle against ecological disaster. Such is the context in which the participants in this conference are working today, and each one of them, through their respective research, artistic, or scholarly practices, is addressing one or several of these challenges. Through the dialogue between our guests, the conference aims to give continuity to the avenues of thought and inquiry opened up by Juan Downey, which have been historically suppressed by the legacies of colonialism and an imposed modernity. In order to reweave ourselves in a more integrated way with the environment. I would like to take a couple of minutes to give you an introduction to the different topics that we will be addressing during the next 3 sessions of the conference before initiating our conversation on Juan Downey today with Javier Rivero Ramos. Our second session, to be held next week, will be entitled Technology for a Disoriented Humanity. It will take as a starting point Juan Downey's early works, which explored the possibilities of human-machine ensembles and the post-human. Those interests led to experiments in interspecies communication and the creation of self-organizing ecological systems in Downey's home and different gallery spaces, among many other projects that he did informed by cybernetics. Thus, a cybernetic inflection also runs through the work of contemporary artists who explore network ecologies and interspecies relationships. In our second session, artist Eduardo Katz will present his exploration of bioart and his work in the context of an expanded conception of ecology. Architectural historian Felicity Scott will speak about the impact of cybernetics and artistic production in the 1960s and 70s and her particular research on these subjects. We will then engage in a conversation on the present day relations between art, architecture, technology, and ecology. Our third session, entitled The Cosmopolitics of the Forest, attempts to give continuity to Downey's dismantling of the ethnographic gaze. His understanding of the cosmogony of the Yanomami, amongst whom he lived for a year between 1976 and 1977, prefigured the current revisions of the notion of animism in present-day anthropology, as well as the very influential concept of Amerindian perspectivism, theorized more recently by Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. A theory that confirms the same ontological status to all beings, human and non-human. This dissolution of the Western duality between nature and culture has in fact had a significant bearing on the contemporary ecological front, an important example being the lawsuit on behalf of the rights of nature filed by the indigenous and environmental activist groups against the Ecuadorian state in 2013. So this session will be organized around those events, a film called Forest Law, made by Ursula Biman and Paulo Tavares, and for the discussion, we have invited Paulo Tavares, activist Franco Viteri Hualinga, and Colombian curator Maria Belén Sáez de Ibarra to talk on these subjects. Our last session, to be held on December the 1st, will address the failed promises of development and the shortcomings of an imposed modernity in Latin America, which have embarked us on a vicious cycle of dependency, corruption, and foreign debt. In this context, corrupt governments are paying those debts with concessions to transnational corporations, giving them free rein to exploit natural resources. Great damage caused to ecosystems and the peoples who inhabit them has further intensified the cycles of dependency, structural poverty, and exploitation. This session, entitled Beyond Technology and Development, Alternatives for the Latin American Problem Today, takes as its point of departure Downey's reiterated critiques of the imposition of Western capitalism in Latin America through the rhetorics of progress and development, which he perceived as a renovation of the legacies of colonialism. Artists Minerva Cuevas and Beatriz Santiago will respectively speak of how their work exposes and critiques the extractive logic of capitalism, the occupation of territories, and the construction of landscape by the contemporary military apparatus. In order to close the conference with a forward-looking perspective, the influential anthropologist Arturo Escobar will speak of his research on post-development, relationality, and pluriversality, later engaging in a conversation with Cuevas and Santiago in order to propose ways of thinking with place and other forms of social organization and relations with the environment that offer more sustainable options to deal with the severity of today's different crises. Thank you. So to start today with Juan Downey, we will introduce these topics through a conversation centered around Downey's engagement with cybernetics. Given that it is possible to identify in cybernetics the discursive connecting thread throughout his multiple bodies of work. Downey's cybernetic utopia proposed a radical reformulation of the relations between man, environment, and technology. So we may ask, what is cybernetics? Norbert Wiener first described cybernetics in the 40s as the scientific study of communications and automatic control systems in both machines and living things. While today cybernetics is often thought of in terms of computing, it is rather about communication, information, and feedback. Much like the Industrial Revolution was a harbinger for the machine age, the development of information technology signified an important shift towards the micro, the digital, and a systems view of the world that shapes our contemporary reality, all of which demanded an interdisciplinary approach, such as cybernetics, developed between the 1940s and 1960s. For Gregory Bateson, one of the most important experts and an anthropologist, cybernetics was an epistemology, that is, a means of knowing and making sense of the world for the information age. Cybernetics was thus theorized by a group of as diverse as the disciplines it drew upon: physicians, neuroscientists, physicists, mathematicians, biologists, semioticians, anthropologists, philosophers, psychiatrists, among others. So Downey grasped the essence of cybernetics in a systems-based view and the solution of the subject and object positions as an ontology of becoming. That is, in a very general and simplified terms, of living beings considered as dynamic systems, ever-changing and in constant exchange with their environment. It is perhaps this aspect of the work and thought that which connects the three axes of this discussion around the environment and ecological thinking in Latin America today. An ontology of becoming allowed Downey to think of interspecies communication and post-human alliances between human and the machine, as well as with other beings, of being able to reweave the chasm between nature and culture through technology. On the other, he identified in the indigenous expanded view of the self, their oneness and with the natural world, an ontology of becoming that transcended the self-other duality and that included animals and the forest as beings endowed with human attributes and vice versa. So to summarize and pass it on to Javier, cybernetics implies the interconnection between machines and living things. Furthermore, it makes no distinction between living things. That is, cybernetics established the fact that an ecology between animal, plant, and human life is necessary to obtain a degree of homeostasis or equilibrium.
Thank you very much, Julieta, for that, well, for the introduction and for that very, very thorough presentation of what is a very complex but very instructive topic, right? And myself, having engaged with Juan's work, both from an editorial and a curatorial standpoint, I can tell you that your interpretation of Juan's engagement with cybernetics is the most compelling approach to his work. What I would like to do today, though, for our conversation is actually very simple. I want to select certain works from Juan and put them in conversation with the ideas that you have expressed to us today, right? I mean, you mentioned this wide array of ideas, right? You have probability theory, electrical engineering, ballistics. I mean, cybernetics is a very complex and very wide field, right? So what I want to find out is how does cybernetics really connect with Juan, right? And what I want to do that in the hopes that we can understand Juan's work in relation to cybernetics, but also in its connection to contemporary and urgent topics, right? Most concretely on the environment in the global south. So can you tell us, sort of in broad strokes, how does Juan Downey engage with cybernetics, right? How would you say that he connects with the topic?
Well, I think the answer, we find it actually in his writings, and there is a diagram that I love to publish and to show where where he actually illustrates the influence of cybernetics in his working process and basically in his working process and in his mind. And it's very interesting because you see that while our historical figures are part of his referential universe, he makes really very specific reference to noted cyberneticians. And then, which signal the importance of this constellation of thinkers as an even greater paradigm for Downey. In fact, the fact that he pairs some of these cyberneticians' names means that he had read these very important papers for the discipline or for this approach that were published much earlier, like in the 1940s and then in the 1950s. So, so this actually, for me, was a proof that cybernetics was at the core of his practice. So then he says that these paradigms actually inform his modes of operating, which are the ecological, the technological, and the ontological. So basically, I have structured this seminar upon those modes, and today we will speak of them in our discussion on Juan's work. So I think that
this is what we were laughing, right? I mean, and I have always found your interpretation of this diagram to be very, very compelling. But I find the diagram itself, and this is probably also Juan's handwriting, but I find the diagram to be a bit mystifying. which is why I would like to ask you to further explain these ideas, maybe using our next image.
Well, of course, Juan is not here to clarify the diagram for us. So, I mean, there's a little bit of detective work and connecting the dots, I guess. And of course, one sometimes reads what one wants into things. But I think you recurrently find these ideas in his work, especially, well, not only just the early work, but also the video work from the 1970s and other types of installations that he did. So we can see that in the modes, he, I think his studio would offer us really a better picture, you know, of this obscure diagram, so to speak. Because there we see a self-organized and self-regulated environment, a total cybernetic environment in which the ecological and the technological are constantly engaged in a feedback dynamic. So the studio itself takes on a new ontological status. It could be thought of as a cyborg, so to speak, and it's a dynamic system which transcends the human-machine duality and challenges the distinction between human, animal, and vegetal life, as well as that between the animate and the inanimate, where everything is interconnected. What would you say, Javier?
I mean, I completely agree, and I love that photograph, which was, by the way, published in that book that we co-edited. Not to toot our own horns, but I think that this drawing in particular further illustrates that, and it also further explains the idea of space being able to self-regulate, right? It is a plan, sort of an architectural plan, of the apartment where Juan lived with his family in New York, in Broadway and East 20th, in the late 1960s. And in the drawing, Juan highlights each element in the house with different colors, right? Natural light with red light, artificial light, animal life, plant life, human life, and all these are seen in this plan to be interconnected, right? There's this juxtaposition of the electronic, the botanic, and the human. However, I think that the one element articulating all of these is actually Juan, and this is something that I want to get to later. But for now, I think of Juan in this apartment in New York, right, downtown New York in the early 1970s, and I can't help to think of the other artists, right, that were around him and of the milieu that was around him, because it's true that he was not the only artist working on the crossroads of art and science and technology. So I was wondering if you could also tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes. In fact, Juan Downey was not alone in his interest in cybernetics. In fact, the epistemological turn enabled by the information age also implied an ontological turn for the work of art, which was clearly reflected in the dematerialized art practices of the time. Art expanded its field to engage with other disciplines as well, and especially scientific ones. In the US, for example, under the patronage of Bell Labs, artists Robert Whitman and Robert Rauschenberg, with engineers Billy Kluver and Fred Waldhauer, founded EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology, which actually went on to organize different events and exhibitions. For example, Jack Burnham, this art historian and theorist, organized a very notable exhibition at the Jewish Museum called Software, which Felicity Scott will actually address in her lecture next week. And on the other side of the Atlantic, for example, as well in the UK, since the 1950s, the influence of the research undertaken by British cyberneticians such as Gordon Pass, Ross Ashby, and Stafford Beer would extend to the art world. For example, in Roy Ascott's Ground Course, Stephen Willett's multi-channel practice and his Control magazine, which he publishes until this day, Jascha Reihart's exhibition Cybernetic Serendipity, the exhibitions organized by Signals, and the New Vision Center. And also, for example, the New Tendencies movement in Zagreb and the magazine that they published, Spit International. And of course, in Paris, the Groupe de Recherche d'Art Visuel Grave, which included Latin American artists who were in Paris and who were also experimenting with art and technology. We can say that also in South America, the CAIC, which was formed in 1969, would also play an influential role bridging this ideas regarding art, cybernetics, and culture. So, and Juan, I must say, was clearly inscribed within this milieu. Since his beginnings as an artist, he was very much a part of this effervescent turn. And the Graf, for example, he met them while he was living in Paris before coming to Washington and then to New York. And he actually befriended them, and they're definitely a very important influence in his early work and in his electronic sculptures. Then he participated in the US presentation of Joshua Reihart's Cybernetic Serendipity, and in EAT's 1968 show, Some More Beginnings.
Right. So we could say, to summarize that, is we have Juan, right, sort of participating in an international wave of interest in the possibilities of the convergence of art and technology. But I think that more importantly, to the point that we want to make, is that he's also grounded, right, in this sort of multidisciplinary discourse that begins as a scientific discourse in the late 1940s in the wake of the Second World War, but that then starts sort of seeping into the cultural milieu, and that by the time that he takes on, it sort of offers the possibility of recasting the artwork not as an object, right, but as a sort of a site for the articulation of this this sort of new ontology for the technological age that has the capacity to dissolve this like subject positions, right? And I find it to be a really, really interesting and fabulous idea. Obviously, we've talked about this at length. But what I would like to do today, for the sake of our audience and for ourselves, for our own sake and sanity probably, is to test out these ideas on some works. And I would like to start with this one. It is an interactive sculpture called Nostalgic Item that Juan made shortly after arriving in the United States, right? I think that he actually made it precisely in answer to a call for proposals that Experiments in Art and Technology put out, right? Which you were mentioning a second ago. And as the explanatory drawing details, it is a sculpture that contains various lasers and streams of light, right? These are the colored elements that we see in the drawing. So when approaching, a member of the audience can actually interact with the sculpture by passing their hand around these lasers, thus activating a switch that turns on a projector and also a recording of Juan's father reading poetry, right? So I would like us to talk about how you see Juan beginning to engage with the discipline of cybernetics during this early stage in his career.
Well, in fact, Javier, the electronic sculptures are indeed a perfect example of this cybernetic approach, in the sense that he creates a device for both viewer and work to establish a communicational network in which both are integrated in the same feedback loop.
Right. But this is where I would like to begin pushing back against you a little bit. In her essay on the Juan Downey monograph that you and I co-edited, and maybe she'll speak a little bit about this in her presentation next week, Felicity Scott describes Juan's techno-optimism, techno-utopia as being on the limits of its historical possibilities in the early 1970s, right? Because already by this early sculpture, 1968, the sort of communicational networks that you are describing had already been weaponized by the industrial military complex. And in the context of the arms race in the Cold War and of the sort of technocratic neoliberal order that ensued, I hear something like your description of a coupling of the human and the machine, technology and invisible forces. And I can't help to think of something more along the lines of cyber warfare, or of, disinformation campaigns spread through social media, or of mass biotechnical surveillance in mainland China, right? And this is sort of my own paranoia. But I believe that the sort of networked automation of communication between human beings and machines was already viewed at the time of Juan, both with enthusiasm and suspicion, right? We have parodies such as back then, such as Dr. Strangelove or Philip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And I think that Juan was very much in touch with this suspicion, right? One aspect of his work that I feel is not remarked upon enough, and it's maybe one of my favorites, is actually his deep sense of humor. I mean, sometimes I feel that he is baiting us, right? Leading us on these wild goose chases. And around the same time that he did Nostalgic Item, for example, he did another sculpture, which I think was maybe if not on that same show at Martin Jackson, then in another one, I'm sure that you'll remember, maybe I'm not right now, called Radioactive Chair, right? That was capable of sensing the radioactive energy, which is very Cold War, right? And then communicating it to the audience via a chair that on which they would sit and that it would shake their asses, right? So we have that kind of a thing. And we have there's something like this drawing, right? Which is a lot darker. And this drawing is part of a series of 3 drawings in which the human and the machine communion is regulated by an algorithm. The drawing proposes a system of biological reproduction whereby an algorithm chooses the biological couple best suited for each person in the world, and thereby it secures the reproduction and the survival of the human race, right? So, I mean, I wonder if you can speak a little bit about this, a little bit about my paranoia, maybe put me at ease.
Well, I think this dystopia comes across in many of his works, including, for example, that project he did for Roosevelt Island, where he talks of sunken factories with these laborers, which sounds like something from a science fiction dystopian movie. But I guess that, like many at the time, he shared this belief in these techno-utopias, but also a feeling of suspicion that these technological advances could actually end up destroying humanity. And but then I would say that more specifically, his view of the world as a series of systems regulated by feedbacks, and in particular relation to technology, actually was consecutively and alternately shaped by 2 approaches. On the one hand, the constructive semantic approximation that characterized his electronic sculptures and his experiments with invisible energy in the early 70s, but on the late 60s, sorry. And on the other hand, the ecologic and communal vision of North American counterculture, which is characteristic of his turn to video in the 1970s. Downey's conception of ecology was actually closely tied to politics, and he shared many of the ideas of Buckminster Fuller, who conceived of the whole Earth as a closed system, a spaceship, where ecological balance was directly linked to political and economic stability, a view that also informed the grassroots, collective, self-organized, sustainable, and ecological approach promoted by publications such as the Whole Earth Catalog and Radical Software. So we can see, for example, Radical Software actually really promoted this idea that technology could be used to reweave this man-nature rift, that was central. And definitely, and its editorial stated, only by treating technology as ecology can we cure the split between ourselves and our extensions. I think these views were shared by many who wrote in the pages of the magazine. For example, the articles published by Bates and also stress and further emphasize this idea, which is also at the center of Downey's text, Technology and Beyond, which is published in an issue of Radical Software, where he was featured on the cover in 1973. And where he also makes a case for technology as the alternative for a disoriented humanity, quote unquote, sorry, and for reweaving civilization back into nature. An idea that he actually experimented with in some of his works, such as some that we will see now, for instance, A Vegetal System for New York State and Life Cycles.
Yeah, I absolutely love these works, and let's discuss them, but they do require some explanation. Right here we have proposal, and it is actually composed out of 2 elements, right? It is a map intervened by Juan, and also a copper box inside of which is a plant. So for everybody following at home, that's that copper box, that brown box, that's this copper box with a plant inside of it. And this plant is connected to electrodes that are in turn attached to a sound system. So when the plant's electric output changes, the electrodes detect this and then translate it through a sound system. So the plant is set to communicate with us. And I'm air quoting for a reason that I will explain later. The other element is a graphic element. It is a map of rural upper state New York. And most of it is covered over by whitewash in a text that reads, plants are capable of perceiving human thoughts and communicating them to distant vegetation. This has been proved by measuring the changes of electrical resistance in the leaves. Proposal, a vegetable system of communication for New York State. White equals the absence of wood and brush. And there are at least two things that I want to pick up here, right? And the first one is the obvious one, this adverse contradiction, because at once Juan proposes, both with the plant in the copper box and with this map, a system of communication built on plants, right? But at the same time, he is informing us that given the level of deforestation experienced by the region, this system is untenable. And then the second thing has got to do more about what I perceive to be a problem in our interpretation. And you see, I think that in the pursuit of breaking the human and nature dyad, which is so urgent nowadays, we might be anthropomorphizing, nature, right? Projecting the human into the non-human. And it has been established by botanists that tree roots actually are able to communicate using fungal filaments. However, to say that they communicate, again, the air quotes, might actually run us into problems, right? I mean, the early cyberneticians were very careful in distinguishing between information and meaning. Information is not meaning, right? Information is statistical, it's probabilistic. And then the last point is that, having actually installed the work, it's that there's a big indifference of the plant towards the human, right? I mean, once you install it, it actually produces these horrible screeches. We actually had to disconnect it because it was unbearable. We almost lost a couple of gallery attendants in the process. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about this.
Well, I think your interpretation points to some aspects which we might say are quite accurate, but on the hand, I also think the map is drawing attention to the fact that human intervention is short-circuiting this communication network in the plant realm. And the plant itself in the gallery space is placed in a very hostile environment. It's very also stressful environment. It's in a dark box without access to light, which is essential to the process of photosynthesis. And it's in fact screaming for help, so to speak. So this work could also be seen as pointing out to the dual role that humans play, first in the destruction of ecological balance, but also in the potential of reverting the damage done. It is perhaps what Downey meant by reweaving the man-nature chasm through technology. It is the metaphor that I find is implicit in this work.
Right. There's you just mentioned a point that I think is actually made very well by life cycles, right? And this is sort of broadly described. This is basically an installation, right? It consists of a beehive and a flower bed. So what Juan does is put these two together and then install a TV camera that is recording the beehive. This video feedback is then sent to a monitor that is placed inside of the flower bed so that the bees can be said to be sort of seeing themselves working, right? And as an aside, for anyone in New York, these works will be on display in a group exhibition that is about to open, and the link will be posted on the chat. What I find most important here is that Juan is actually creating what he calls, and this is something that I think that you were getting at as well, he creates what he calls a responsive environment, right? The key element of feedback here is not video, right? Because the video is merely illustrative. The bees don't need video to know how to work. But for Juan, the fact that the bees are surviving, then the colony is thriving, it tells him something, right? So he has somehow created an environment in which he has intervened and his interventions are communicated to him. And I think that this is very important. Recently, well, in 2013, Bruno Latour called for the revitalization of politics through ecologization, right? Through its extension into the cosmos of non-human agency where humanity takes place. And I think that to me, this is very important. And I think that it is actually exemplified even further by another work called Make Chile Rich that I would also like to discuss with you.
Well, so it's actually a relatively minor work in his production, but it is a pivotal one, I must say, that evidences his ecological interest and grassroots activism. For example, the work addresses issues such as the exploitation of natural resources, land use, and local economies in the context of a complex network of relations between food supply, agriculture, and the role of transnational corporations that aim to substitute the naturally and abundantly occurring nitrate of sodium in Chile.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, and it is actually also a historical occurrence, right? I mean, Chilean nitrate of soda potash, better known as Chilean saltpeter, was one of the country's most profitable exports before the turn of the 20th century. So that with the artificial syntheses of nitrogen fertilizers in Europe, Chile was not only lost a valuable export, but also entered into a cycle of dependency whereby the stability of its agriculture depended on foreign exports, right? So this starts getting us into some of the topics that we're going to be talking, that you organized for this conference. And the issue of geopolitics and its overlap with extractivist industries, mining in particular, comes to the fore with the sculpture entitled Anaconda Map of Chile, right? I think that this work really speaks to that intricate relation between ecology, geopolitics, and art that the conference puts at center and forward, right? The work features a large map of Chile that designates the several mining sites owned by the Anaconda Copper Mining Company. The map is then placed inside of a box with a live anaconda slithering inside of it. And incidentally, Juan first installed his work at a New York venue called the Center for Inter-American Relations, whose founder, David Rockefeller, was also a major stakeholder of Anaconda Copper, right? So Juan was implying that this patron of the arts, of the Latin American arts, right, was also part of a transnational conglomerate of foreign capitalists preying on his country. And as a result, as you know, Juan was forced to remove the snake from the work, as we can see in the photograph. And this all happened in 1973, which is a turning point. It is a turning point for Chile, for Juan's relation to his country and to South America, and for his own relation to the United States. 1973 was the year when the democratically elected president Salvador Allende was deposed and killed in a coup d'etat backed by the CIA. So I'd like to ask you, how do you think that this political urgency relates specifically to Juan's understanding of cybernetics and its implications for Latin America?
Well, I think this, even though it may not seem so at first sight, is actually very closely related to cybernetics and the importance of cybernetics in his thought, and actually what the idea of reflexivity meant in the shift from first to second order cybernetics. For example, this shift proposed information as not as a thing, but rather as an action, a dynamic that would result from the diverging views that oppose homeostasis and reflexivity. The former implied the reification of information, and the latter advanced the notion of information as action. The system's reflexivity generates human subject as an observer too. And we could see this at play in many of the works that he produces henceforth. After the coup in Chile, he decides to take this road trip to Latin America, but he also decides to use Tool as a, how would I say, a tool for social transformation. Actually, many of the artists who were working within the frameworks of systems and communication, especially with video, they saw this idea of reflexivity that was contained in the video's potential for feedback and playback as a tool for social transformation. For example, Paul Ryan writes about that, but also Marshall McLuhan. They were very idealistic about, for example, what video and TV perform in terms of being able to present a mirror to society and that it could look at itself in there. So this notion of autonomy is also another one that is very important in this shift from first to second order cybernetics, which is paramount to understand the ideological drive against dependency in many Latin American artists during that period, including Downey and many of those who were affiliated to the CAIC, among others. Downey saw in cybernetics a call for social change, a revolution with the detection, processing, and dispersal of information, a diversity of signal in multi-directional networks. And that for him was essential if the pyramidal oppressive hierarchy that misinforms the base had to be taken down from the apex. So,
right. Yeah, sorry.
So Video Transamerica's operates between these coordinates of reflexivity, but also autonomy. Autonomy as a result of this reflexivity and of generating an observer, a conscious observer, an observer that is aware of his conditions.
Absolutely, no, and I think that this is completely to the point of Video Transamerica's, right? Of shifts regarding reflexivity and the observer. And this is a complex work, so I would like to explain it a little bit. It is a work that we should understand as a spatially and temporally protracted work, right? So it's not so much an object or an installation as much as a project. It was a project whereby Juan drove in this very picturesque van that we see here. He drove from Manhattan all the way to the Chilean island of Chiloé in South America, right? And all along the route in Texas, in Yucatan, in Machu Picchu, and in Uros, for instance, Juan would stop and he would record video in order to play it back in another location, right? So that video shot in Texas would then be played in Merida, or in video in Merida would be played in San Luis Potosí, right? The point being that what he wanted to do is for each culture to be able to play itself back to itself, and for the continent to be able to play back to itself. Right, so you begin to see precisely what I think that you're talking about, this turn in reflexivity. And in the travelogue that he wrote as part of the road trip, he actually described Video Transamerica's as, quote, a form of evolution in space that also unfolds in time, playing back one culture in the context of another, as well as the culture itself in its own context. But one of the more important things here is also that during this trip is when he first comes into contact with the Amazons, right? So I was wondering if you could tell us, what do you think drove him there?
Well, definitely Video Transamerica's is what leads him there. This idea of uniting or creating these contact zones, so to speak, for these different indigenous peoples to get to know each other through the agency of video, and this exchange of information, which is seen by Juan as a dynamic form of agency, but it's also a dynamic form of agency that would contribute to the creation of autonomous and autopoietic forms of organization for these communities, which is something that we will discuss actually in further sessions, in the next sessions. But I guess Juan went to, Juan went to Amazon. He actually applied for a grant, a Guggenheim grant, and he got it. And with this project to research one of the most untouched indigenous communities in the Amazon, which is the Yanomami. They're spread along the border between Venezuela, Brazil, and Colombia, I think a little bit. But mostly in Brazil and Venezuela and the Roraima region. And so he read about this, about the Yanomami in Pierre Class' Society Against the State, which was a book that really influenced him very much. And Pierre Class' thesis that societies without government were the societies that would be able to thrive in an ecological harmony with their surroundings as well. And that were organized as well in these more transversal and autopoietic forms that recalled those of cybernetics. So these were all ideas that really interested Juan in these communities. And so he applied for this grant and went to Venezuela. And I think this experience really changed his view on not only on the techno-utopias that had informed his work in such a way, such an important way since the 1960s, but also in regard to his views on Latin America and on the rift between nature and culture, and on the forms of knowledge that characterize these indigenous societies and their oneness with nature. So I think he forgets about his project of uniting these indigenous cultures as he had in Video Transaméricas, because the Yanomami were not so interested in seeing other.
Right.
And also because this was a culture that had, at the time, very, very little contact with civilization. So
what would you say that what did he find there that was so valuable?
Well, he found first a stateless society, whose relation to the environment he also found very fascinating, and through its architecture. So he found in their communal dwelling, the Shabono,
right,
embodiment, not only of this form of social organization, they live in these, they organize in families, in hearths, which he didn't call it, it was actually Jacques Lizo who called them the circle of fires, within this circular lean-to structure that is made from the trees and the leaves and everything in the forest. A clearing is made and the material is used to make this structure, which then begins to disintegrate naturally about 3 to 4 years later. And then once that happens, this architecture goes back to the earth where it came from, and then they go and change to another place where they found other new resources, make another clearing, and start this cycle all over again. So it's a cyclical architecture. It's ecological. It doesn't leave any carbon footprint, and also the way it organizes the human beings who live and who dwell there. It's also indicative of this stateless and transversal society.
And I think that this is, sorry to interrupt you, but I think that this is actually kind of a good segue into like one of my questions, perhaps my last question for you, which is how do you see Juan actually, how do you see him sort of embodying? How do you see this place embodying his pursuit for a form of ecologized invisible architecture?
Well, I think actually, what do you mean? Well, no, what I think is that he really, at that point, he realizes that this so-called primitive society is really.
Well, I guess what I mean is that you have written that
he had been designing. I mean, there are projects that he did, like for the Museum of Contemporary Art Houston, the project for Roosevelt Island. So project and his project for his own house at the beach, which are these ecological buildings. But
right,
here,
I guess what I mean very specifically is this thing that you wrote that says that you wrote that his experience with the Yanomami hinged around the act of observation, right, and a calling into question of the role of the observer. And this interpretation seems especially acute with an iconic video work by Juan called The Laughing Alligator, right, this sort of mock travelogue video where he disassembles the traditional ethnographic film by making himself the object of the Yanomami's gaze. And I was wondering if this sounds right to you.
Oh, definitely. And this change of perspective is also pivotal, not only in terms of the inversion of the ethnographic gaze, but also what it implies, today, to think of Juan Downey's work today and of the implication it has in not only in the field of anthropology, but also ecology, etc. So when he hands a video camera to the Yanomami, Downey understands this, those consequences, the ecological consequences of this change of perspective. When he gives a camera to the Yanomami, instead of filming Juan or someone else at the center of the frame, he basically films it like a little head at the corner, and then you just have the jungle occupying all of the frame. Yeah. So he asks him, why is the forest occupying everything? But really it's like nothing, it's just noise, you know, it's the brush. And he says, no, we are the forest and the forest is us. So so really he has a realization that for them, for the Yanomami, there is no subject. There is self is intertwined with this natural environment. And I think also this functions a little bit as what Viveiros de Castro has theorized as his viewpoint of the indigenous through the Amerindian perspectivism theory. So here's where he really encounters this ontology of becoming, this oneness with nature.
Right, and you spoke right now, and I guess we're running a little bit short on time. So you mentioned Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, and I think this is a good point to wrap it up. So I was wondering if you could tell us, how do you think Juan foreshadows, right, the development of this Amerindian activism?
Well, for the one thing, I think that this change of perspective for Juan changed his work, but also his viewpoint and of how he could also articulate a defense of indigenous forms of social and economic organization as alternatives to Western notions of state and capital, which is something that he does. And there's a video that he does later, and it's really about Chile, not about the Yanomami, but where he describes this ideas again in terms of the damage done by the imposition of economic policies from Washington in Latin America. So, and today we see that indigenous groups are working on this front, and in an interdisciplinary alliance, they are managing to generate conditions of ontological displacement that imply the consideration of the forest as a legal subject, and the rehabilitation of indigenous forms of knowledge is that are close to nature and land. So, and these pose alternative and viable solutions, you know, as well as video indigenous communities using video as a tool to represent themselves, such as the Kayapo in Brazil, who started using it early in the 1980s and have really been exceptional in their use of video as a tool for their self-representation and activism. And then I think we can end with this very, very recent image during the pandemic, an image of the Yanomami Shabono, and that they have made using video technology such as a drone to send a message to the miners who are threatening their environment. So it says, Fora Garimpo, miners outside. So thank you.
Thank you, Julieta, very much.
So now I'd like to take the time to think of some questions from the public that they have been writing to us. And so maybe I'll choose a couple because we're really running short of time right now. I think we're over already. A couple of panelists have asked about the relation between Downey and cybernetics, but is there any information that connects him to the cyber sin that Stafford Beer helped implement with Salvador Allende in Chile? Actually, no, there's no connection, but it's something that actually we wanted to address in the talk. It's not related to Downey at all. I mean, he probably knew of it, but he had no relation.
I'd like to just continue to answer that question very briefly. I mean, there was no connection, but you and I would have been able to just go off on another hour-long riff, which is expressly not what we were supposed to do.
And Arturo Escobar asked me if I wonder if Downey met and engaged with the work of Francisco Varela, Maturana and Varela, and absolutely yes. Actually, in the obscure diagram where it says Pitts McCulloch, actually that's a paper that was co-authored by Maturana, which is what the frog's eye tells the frog's brain. So if Downey read that, he would of course be familiar with the work of Maturana very early on. And I think autopoiesis is a central concern, along with reflexivity in terms of not only this anthropological work, but his video work in general and the work with feedback. And from Benjamin Murphy, I have a question.
Oh, hey, Ben.
On how cybernetics intersects with the issues of gender and sexuality in Downey's work. And he's thinking of Catherine Hale's argument that the distributed or network model of cognition imagined by second order cybernetics constituted a highly gendered fantasy of disembodiment that often tended to erase the embodied labor of woman that was so central to cybernetics' own material conditions of production. Does Downey, so I'm going to throw this one to you, Javier. Does Downey's engagement of cybernetics carry its own gendered dimension?
I mean, I hope that my Downey credentials are not going to be put in question by this, but yeah, absolutely, I think it does. I mean, I think that one certainly had a sort of, and you can see this a lot in his drawings. He was, I mean, I find that his notions of, I wouldn't say that they continue a fantasy of disembodiment, because I find that they are actually fairly embodied, right? I mean, there are a lot about a sort of armored biology, right? It's a sort of like an armoring of the body that remains very much gendered. I mean, I think that if we look at a project like the one that we saw earlier on Selectromate, right? I mean, that's like a very sort of gendered way to see it. And I think that there was something a little bit redolent of a certain machismo in him, for sure. Absolutely. So. But I think that he's actually 2 steps behind your question, Ben. I mean, I think that he actually didn't even get to the point where he actually saw it as like the cybernetics as a disembodiment. I think that he saw it more kind of Julieta, the way that she's phrasing it, as more of an ontological change that does not necessarily, I think, translate into a body, because it's so structured along communication. I would just say, but I'm not an expert, and I'm not particularly well read on that topic.
Well, and I have one last question from Gina Tarver about who were the Latin American artists and intellectuals who were part of his context other than the Caïque and those of the Grave. Well, he knew, for example, Jaime Davidovich in New York, and Eduardo Costa, many of the Latin American artists living in New York at the time. And then he had, of course, relations with many Chilean artists as well. And all the names have seemed to have disappeared from my...
Actually, I mean, I think that an important point to make is that Juan was, of course, a Latin American artist and deep Latin Americanist in the 70s, but he was very much a New York artist as well. I mean, I think that he actually was more in contact with Latin American artists in Paris when he was like with the Groupe de Recherche Visuelle, with the kineticists over there. I mean, I think that he formed more of a milieu that is not so easy to pinpoint geographically. I don't know if that sort of answers the question.
Well, Gordon Matta Clark was also very close to him, so we can say also Matta Clark had both dimensions. He was both American, but also Chilean, so yes. So, well, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you next week at the second session of the conference, Technology for a Disoriented Humanity, with guests Felicity Scott and Eduardo Katz, next Wednesday, November 18th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time.
Yeah, thank you everybody, and thank you everybody for the questions. Apologies we were not able to get to all of them, but thank you so much for coming, everybody.
And you can access the registration information through the link in the chat. So thank you so much for joining, and I hope this was instructive for you.